Birth control of choice for almost half of married couples in our country is sterilization. Among this large group are more and more couples who are experiencing second thoughts about having such birth control procedure. For some of these, a deep conviction has emerged motivating them to reverse the vasectomy or tubal ligation. On this tape, you'll hear from David and Nina Morton of Oklahoma about their decision on this important issue.
Hi, my name's Dave Morton, and I'm here tonight with my lovely wife, Nina. We've been asked to share with you our story. This is a story about love and pain, fear and anger, faith and enlightenment, and healing. It's a story about ordinary life, but one that we think that many couples here might be able to relate to. I'm 49 years old and I have 8 children. I have 2 boys from a prior marriage and 3 with Nina, one of which I adopted. We also have 3 adopted children from Ethiopia. And today I'd like to tell you that I'm a whole man. I'm intact physically and mentally, at least I think so anyway. But I wasn't always that way. I'm an 18-year naval aviator and veteran. I was fortunate enough to meet Nina in the spring of 1993 when I returned home from Desert Shield and Desert Storm. We got married in October of that year up in Vermont in a quiet Justice of the Peace type ceremony. And I guess you could say that our early relationship was a wonderful period of love and respect for each other and a great deal of hope for our future. In September of '94, our beautiful daughter Emily was born. She is a wonderful blessing from God. In the summer of '95, we transferred down to Norfolk, Virginia, and I got custody of my 2 older boys. Now, these are wonderful boys, but they had some long-lasting emotional scars that even today they're still trying to work through from some really horrible treatment they had suffered. They came into our family with much bigger problems than either Nina and I had realized or were really prepared for. And in February of '96, Nina gave birth to our son Sean, which brings our child count to 5. Now, the emotional demands and the stresses and the pain surrounding this young family really began to build in earnest just before Sean was born. And along about this time, there began this growing concern from people around us that the number of children we had was certainly sufficient. Everyone began to suggest, 5 is certainly enough, isn't it? My wife was born a Roman Catholic, and while I was never too inclined toward faith or religion per se, but after we moved to Virginia, I developed a longing for the Catholic faith. I turned toward God and entered RCIA. I began a journey that would carry me across many difficult moments and later many wonderful discoveries. And with 5 children, a solid career, a lovely wife, and a bright future, things were really looking up, or so one might suppose. One day, the idea of sterilization came creeping into our daily conversations. And I didn't pay much attention to it at first, but it persisted until getting a vasectomy seemed to be the lead issue between my wife and I. When I thought about this idea, I really wanted to get some distance from it. I was afraid of the surgery, timid of the post-surgery pain, etc., etc. I wondered if I'd still be a man, if I'd still be me, whoever me was. I couldn't admit my feelings, though, to anyone, let alone my wife. It seemed like I was very, very unsettled and uncomfortable with this whole thing that seemed to be forced on me. And I always felt that if I did this, I'd somehow be separated from the world and my wife and my family. Nina began telling me how stressed out she was. She was tired and she didn't really want to have any more kids. 5 was plenty. I saw the toll that this growing family and all of its emotional demands were taking on her. Well, the next wave of vasectomy soldiers came marching into my life. It was my in-laws, whom I love very dearly and respect a great deal, but they came bearing down on me very hard. And they began to suggest that I consider getting fixed. Why do people say that, getting fixed? Why don't they just say get sterilized or vasectomy? Well, anyway, they worked very diligently to persuade me so that I would give in and join the ranks of other neutered men. I don't know why, but I never got any counseling from the church about this issue. I didn't even realize what I was about to do was a sin. In fact, there's a lot of Catholics that actually encouraged me to go ahead and do it. I never considered the spiritual or the conjugal consequences of such a simple procedure. The idea of sterilization made me angry, though, and afraid and resentful. I swelled up with animosity toward my in-laws and my wife. It seemed like the more I resisted, though, the longer they persisted. Their personal attacks became more frequent and they cut much deeper. I didn't like being called a baby. I didn't like their innuendos that I was acting like a scared little boy, or that I was somehow an unsupportive and unempathetic husband. Clearly, I had lost control, and I had no choice. Everyone made comments like, "Oh, you're doing the right thing. Think about your wife. She'll be saved from any more stress or pain. It's better that you do it than she, after all. Think about this, sex with no worry." Oh, there was a lot of other comments that were just as deceitful. Look, it was the 90s, okay? Everybody was doing it. What's the big deal? Well, my biggest mistake in all this was not taking all of my concerns to Christ in prayer. Finally, with no spiritual reinforcement or counseling on my side, I capitulated. I gave up and caved in. It's kind of ironic, though, when you think about it, isn't it? I succumbed to this unrelenting pressure to do the, quote, manly thing. But it seems peculiar to me somehow that the manly thing is unusual in the sense that you're mutilating an integral aspect of your manhood. How manly is that? In April of '96, I submitted myself to the Navy's chop shop style of vasectomy production line. It was very demeaning. I joined 31 men and a couple of unsuspecting boys, maybe 20 years old, if that. We lined up in a hallway outside a treatment room in a naval hospital. All of us were just waiting around for the sterilization games to begin. Every 5 minutes or so, another guy was called into the treatment room, and I was really frightened. I couldn't stop this train. It was getting run right over me. I was scared of losing my manhood and whatever else went with it. But finally, it was my turn, and dutifully I stumbled into the treatment room and hopped up onto the table with that white crinkly paper you're probably all familiar with. I tried to act very mature and nonchalant and detached. I mean, after all, they were right, weren't they? Really, what's the big deal? The doctor walked in, he began the procedure. It was a quick prep of the area, 2 sudden sticks of a needle to deaden the area. And then those compassionate, calming words I remember. Just relax, it'll all be over in a minute or two and you'll be good as new. Sure, relax, I can do that. The doctor pulled out a knife and began slicing, a tug here, some pulling there, a snip on each side of my vas deferens. Sure enough, it was all over. Hardly. He put a big clamp on each one of the wounds and said he was done. There were no complications. And after he took the clamps off, he told me to take it easy for a couple of days, use some ice and take the pain medication, Motrin. He shook my hand and said goodbye. And as I started for the door, he said, "Hey, don't worry about it. In a couple of days, you're going to be just as good as new." Sure, there's the big lie. I remember the joke that was going around the ward that morning in the hospital. Be sure and pack 'em like fresh fish, or you'll be real sore. Some joke. I guess that's how men relate to these kinds of things, though. When I came out of the treatment room, I remember looking at my wife, Nina. She looked upset. She was almost sullen. And she helped me down to the car and drove us home. About halfway home, the numbness finally wore off and the pain began. And by the time I got into my bed at home, the pain was full-scale deflection, and trust me, the ice bags and Motrin didn't help much. The deed was done. So was I. I was different. My manhood had been removed. Now here's the reality of having manhood cut out of your body, at least for me. First, I was not and probably would never be as good as new again. Second, it's not snip, snip, clamp, clamp, and off to work in the morning. No way. And third, my pain was very real and long-lasting. Nearly 7 years post-mutilation, I still suffered from continual pain in my left testicle. It never went away. It was always there to remind me of that early morning romp through surgical stupidity. Now, I admit that most men have this procedure done, and they have very few complications, if any, and they probably do get back to their lives and work in a couple of days as normal as they can be. Yet the fact remains, I did have those complications, and I did have very real, long-lasting pain, and neither Nina nor I had any idea how much other suffering was held out for our future. All my life, I've been a pretty active guy. I've always been strong of both mind and body, fairly muscular from physical activity and routine workouts. I had a fairly strong libido, and I enjoyed the life that I had with my wife and my lover and my soulmate. I began to realize all those fears, however, about the after effects of my sterilization. I listened to all the intellectual type, high-priced psychotherapists as they all would resound in unison. "Hey, Dave, it's all in your head. Nothing's changed in your body." Well, I must have been suffering from some post-sterilization anxiety or something. Or perhaps that's a label doctors would give something that they can't necessarily describe as a medical phenomenon. I had changed drastically. I lived with this nagging pain that caused no end of distress for me when I attempted to work out or run or even walk. It aggravated me when I sat for extended periods of time, which, by the way, pilots of airplanes must do daily. I was no longer active. I didn't even care about it anymore. My conjugal relationship with the woman of my dreams was going south too. Peculiar as it seems, though, I believe now that that pain I was suffering was actually a blessing, because it was the pain and blessing that led me back to God and back into His graces. In 1998, I left the United States Navy and I took a job with the U.S. Marshal Service for Con Air. Probably familiar with that. It was an exciting time for us, a time of new expectations, new beginnings, new territories. I bought our first home. I bought Nina a couple of horses for our little 5-acre ranch here in Edmond. I was making things happen. I was making her dreams come true. I was helping her to feel happy again. You know, material things have a way of giving a person a false sense of success and happiness. And self-gratification rarely lasts too long. It wasn't long before we started having these world-class arguments, you know, the kind you see on television. That red hair Nina has is no lie. You know, we'd argue over everything, and we'd argue over nothing. You name it, we argued about it. I was disillusioned and unhappy. I didn't want to fight with Nina anymore. It seemed that we resented each other, and somehow we knew that we had serious marital problems, and even through all that, we still knew that we loved each other deeply. We finally realized that my sterilization was a serious sin, so we went and sought forgiveness through the sacrament of reconciliation. And together we turned our focus toward Christ and our children, and in trying to keep our marriage together. We continued to go to church and pray for forgiveness and for tolerance of each other and for ourselves. We prayed a lot. But, you know, there didn't seem to be anything that I could do about this death spiraling relationship. It wasn't too long before my weight began to increase. I stopped caring about my appearance or general health. In response to the problems we were having, I dove headlong into my job, became a workaholic. I was tired all the time. You know, this wasn't all in my head. The fact was, I had suffered an ugly act of mutilation years ago. The effects of that stupid surgical procedure were taking an ever-increasing toll on my entire family, my wife, and me. I never considered that the sterilization could cause such turmoil in our lives. One day out of the blue, Nina came to me and asked me if I ever thought about getting a reversal. Well, I dismissed that comment right offhand. But it was a question, or her suggestion, that planted a very important seed. Nina decided that adoption was something that we ought to look into. And she told me one day about her idea and asked me if I had any problems with adopting a child from Ethiopia. Wow. Well, sure, I was really prepared for that, huh? Well, I wasn't very thrilled with the idea at first, as you can well imagine. But I prayed about it and I eventually agreed. I thought, you know, maybe this would help us rediscover our relationship together. So here was our new beginning. Rosie shows up pretty as a picture. Nina and I were filled with love and joy at the new child God had just given us. And it wasn't too long after Rosie showed up that 2 more children from Ethiopia found their way into our little family. Now I have to tell you that all 3 of these wonderful children found their way into our home through various pathways that only God Himself could have directed. So our count now stands at 8. For a time, things were better. But, you know, we still had some distance between us that we had to cover and some more pain to go through. Nina's health has always been a big concern of mine. She's always suffered from headaches, neck pain, and so forth. But she's always worked through it. She had fibromyalgia and was dealing with it. But now it seemed that she's been diagnosed with systemic lupus. Her health problems were really serious now, and she was suffering badly and nearly all the time. Her health condition was steadily deteriorating, and guess what? My attitude wasn't far behind. Forget about our sexual relationship, it was nearly gone. I began to think that perhaps I was becoming impotent. Whatever happened to that young, vibrant, head-over-heels-in-love couple that started this journey back in Vermont? In the spring of 2002, I went with Nina to Dr. Petula's office for, of all things, to talk about the reproductive nature of a woman. and some of the female problems my wife Nina was having. I got a real quick indoc on the Creighton model and the male-female connection. And what's funny about all this is that suddenly, without any warning, when we were talking about these things, I found myself responding to one of his questions, which took me immediately back to the day I got my sterilization, and all that anger and emotion just came rushing out. I got louder and I got more animated. And Nina had to interrupt me at one time so I could actually get my composure back. Wow, I don't know where that flood of emotion came from, but it just came flooding through. And while I was spilling my guts out to this guy, I didn't even know. How's that work? Dominic expressed some empathy for my situation and respect for my feelings, and I finally settled down. And then I began to listen. He talked about the physiological oneness between a husband and his wife. And what he said made a lot of sense to me. And while I understood and perhaps agreed a lot with what he was suggesting, I wasn't exactly going to run off to the local chop shop and get my tubes tied back together again. I mean, I didn't have the money to do that, and I certainly didn't have the inclination. Well, a little while later, Nina approached me for the second time about vasectomy reversals. This time, though, she was a lot more serious and much more sincere than she had been in the past. And she could tell, though, that I was still in no mood for that conversation. Remember that seed she had planted a few years back? I prayed about it and then went to go talk to a priest. He explained that I was forgiven from my sin of sterilization and that I was under no obligation to get it reversed. He commended Nina and I for having remained open to life, having been continuously willing to receive God's blessings into our family. Hey, look, I had the church's endorsement now, but I still felt bad about it. I attempted to placate Nina all the time with things like, hey, we're under no obligation. We'll see. Talk about it later, dear. I understand how you feel, but I really can't afford this kind of nonsense. But she was undaunted. She seemed to know something that I didn't and was motivated to help me understand her feelings and help me discern my own truth. I didn't want to do anything, though, unless I was completely convinced that I had no choice except to correct this hack job I had suffered several years ago. I had daily pain to remind me about that mistake, and I really didn't want to repeat it or exacerbate it. I think that's understandable. Nina began in earnest to persuade me, but in a subtle, gentle, and much more loving way. Not that argumentative or combative way that we had several years ago. And I agreed to pray about it and to see what would happen. And one day Nina told me Dr. Padula suggested that we go meet with Father McCaffrey. So we went and talked with him. And Father McCaffrey, a.k.a. the Sledgehammer, asked us both some questions. He wanted to get to know us a little bit and a little bit about our stories. And I sat quietly, which is amazing for me, and listened intently. But I noticed that my answers were leading me back to that emotional plateau again where all that anger was swelling up and coming out. And Father McCaffrey remained very calm, but then he cut immediately to the chase. And with plain clarity and no holding back, he decided to level Christ's knockout punch right on my chin and spun me clean around. I felt guilty and ashamed all at once. I had no rebuttal. I was losing the battle for my body all over again, but maybe that was precisely the issue from the start. Maybe it was never really mine to control in the first place. I couldn't deny the truth that he was speaking, and over the next weeks, while I'd try, I'd fall back to that comfortable position. Hey, no money, no cutting, period. But there was a spiritual battle going on inside me. I kept taking that easy, familiar path, believing all along that my financial condition was going to save me from ever having to face the truth of this thing. And through my prayer and discernment, I came to understand that my sterilization didn't just affect me. It adversely impacted Nina. And that was precisely what Dr. Padula was explaining to me several months back. Because she was a part of me and I was a part of her, that lost we somehow created some enormous adverse circumstances for her and for us. Somehow she was no longer able to physically or spiritually connect with that God-given essence of us from me. And this unforeseen and very unfortunate circumstance resulted in serious long-term medical ramifications for her. But through all this time, I believe God was probably working in the background. And the more I prayed, the more things changed and opened my eyes. My wife called me one day while I was at work, and she was very excited, and she told me that through the Edith Stein Foundation, all of our financial problems, those roadblocks, had been removed. Dr. Padula had made all the necessary arrangements for me to undergo the reversal, and all I had to do was just show up. What's that all about? How does that work? Anyway, that night on the way home from work, I decided to stop by my church. I prayed and I gave it all up to God. And I asked him sincerely on my knees, is this your will for me to do this? And I think I got my answer clearly and slowly and calmly. And there was no mistaking his truth. And I caved in again, but this time to the will of God. And I agreed to do as I was told. Nina and I met the surgeon who was going to do the reversal, and we explained to him that this wasn't just about having a baby, okay? Mostly it was because I felt compelled to undo this wrong thing I'd done so many years ago. Well, I tromped off into the operating room full of hope and a little anxiety. And when I woke up in recovery, I didn't even realize that it was all over. This was a completely different experience than what I'd had in the Navy. As it turns out that my recovery was almost immediate, and as a matter of fact, 3 days later I was back to work on Monday and feeling totally normal again. And I'm happy to tell all of you here today that I no longer have any more pain in my left testicle. It's all gone. I'm 49 years old and I have 8 children, 3 of which were adopted from Ethiopia. Today I am a whole man. I am intact physically, mentally, and at long last, spiritually. I no longer have all that physical, emotional, and spiritual pain following me. And when I got sterilized, I separated myself from my wife and from God. And when I let God and his special miracle of life be removed from my body, I altered all of my relationships, particularly my conjugal union with my wife. Now, I can't describe exactly for you what that special something is exactly, but I'm absolutely certain when I got my vasectomy, I lost it. My manhood was removed from me without my complete understanding or awareness. I hope that everyone will understand that this is not all in one's head. It's in their heart. It's in their soul. Today, I believe the sterilization of a man or a woman, while generally accepted, or perhaps I should say condoned, by this American culture of death, is truly Satan's greatest lie. Working in very subtle ways, he gets smart and vulnerable, unsuspecting people to ignore the reality of God's plan. I'd like to thank God for his divine mercy in guiding me to this place with all these wonderful people. Father McCaffrey, your words were truly the inspired words of God. I'd like to thank you for having the courage to speak them to me plainly. And I'd like to thank God for leading us both to Dominic and Bernie Padula. I don't know how we can ever repay such a great kindness. And I'd like to say thanks to everyone who abides in God's plan and helped us back into his glory and graces. Hopefully, after hearing our story, at least one man or one woman will be convinced and empowered to resist the intimidation and the social pressures of our society of death and just say no to sterilization. When I woke up in recovery, my wife did something that will be with me forever. She said, "There you are." And then she smiled and she kissed me. I'd like to thank you all for coming and letting me share my story with you. May God bless you.
I'm Nina, and I guess you would say this is the wife's perspective. It's a little bit different than David's. When I was first asked to do the story, I was reluctant because I was scared. I've never shared with anybody anything like this, especially something so personal and to so many people at once. But yet I was really grateful and happy to have the opportunity to be able to share something that was so profound in our life and so much healing. I wanted to give that back. I felt like it was a gift and I needed to pass it on. I used the word sterilization because vasectomy for me became a word that was too nice for something that was so spiritually and life depleting. When I think about what comes to mind as to why we sterilized, fear came to my mind. There was a great deal of social pressure, pressure from family. There was a lack of trust in myself and in my husband. There was a lack of trust in God and a lack of understanding of our faith. But fear was definitely the lead motivator. As you already heard, we went from 2 children to 5 in 3 months. This, needless to say, was a little bit much for me. These 2 boys that were pretty much brought to my doorstep uninspectedly, they brought with them enormous problems. They had been abused, and I spent 2-3 days a week in counseling for several years with these children. Somewhere in all of this turmoil and adjustment, those first few months that I got these boys, the fear really set in. And instead of turning to God and prayer for my answer, I turned to my family and to social remedies. Before Sean was even born, vasectomy was already decided. I was really scared about having another child. What the heck was I going to do if I got pregnant? I had all these kids. I didn't know if I would even be sane anymore. And I have to admit, I was really worried about what my family would think if I had another baby, and what society how they would judge me if I had another baby. And I knew I loved having babies with my husband, and I knew we would have another baby. I just knew it. I was born a Catholic, but at this time in my life, I was an occasional mass goer. I didn't really know my faith very well. I didn't get a firm foundation when I grew up. And ironically, during this time, Dave was attending RCIA. Now, I knew things like contraception and sterilization were against the rules. So I brought this to my parents. I wanted some answers from them because they lived their faith, I thought. By this time, they were giving me names of doctors to get this done. They were just convinced that this is where I needed to be. The response to me was, these kind of things, they happen all the time. The church really doesn't look at it anymore. They kind of overlook this stuff. These were my parents. They were who I went to for direction when it came to the faith. They were pillars in their church community. And the priests that I grew up with, they never really said much about contraception. So to me, the church really didn't play a part in my decision. Now I had to convince David. And again, it was fear that I turned to. I told him if he didn't get himself cut, that I was going to get cut. And I knew there was no way that that man would let me go into the blade. He said, God made you perfect the way you are, and perfect is how you'll stay. So with the help of my parents and a little pushing, he finally agreed. When Dave came out of surgery, I knew instantly that sullenness I had, I knew nothing would ever be the same between us. I would never share in the creation of life with my soulmate. He would never look at me the same for allowing him to mutilate the essence of our union. He wouldn't let me go into the knife because he loved me. And I used that love that he had for me to manipulate him and to push him into mutilating the very essence of our union. Okay, well, life goes on, it's done. We don't talk about it. Occasionally he complains of some pain here and there, and I figure, well, he'll get over it, it'll go away. And that's about as far as we go with it. Well, soon Dave and the 2 new boys we had became Catholic. They came into the church, and with that, we had our marriage blessed. And I'm standing there before this priest, before God, and I'm sitting here thinking, oh, this is so hypocritical. I'm making a promise to be open to life, to allow God's procreative love to work in our union, when just a couple months prior, we just cut God and all that procreative stuff completely out of our newly sacramental union. Well, God has a really funny way, and he's pretty persistent in giving me opportunities to live up to the promises that I make, especially when they're in a sacrament. And I have to tell you, out of the blue, I got this need, this deep burning need to know Christ better. Not through the eyes of a child or how my parents brought Christ to me, and not through how a secular society viewed the church, but I wanted a personal relationship with Christ. I wanted all the teachings of the Catholic Church as my guide because that's who I was. And along with this, I had all these kids, and they needed something, and it wasn't what I was doing. They needed the same thing that I was looking for. So I chose to homeschool. I figured, well, I don't know anything about it. My kids need it. I'm going to homeschool him and I'm going to teach him and I'm going to learn. And when you start teaching Catholicism, you start learning it and you start living it. It's kind of hard to teach your child and not live it. It's just there. We moved to Oklahoma in 1998, and it was a wonderful spring. It was just full of new things. And then summer came, and it was a summer from hell. It wasn't because of the heat, which didn't help, but it was really, it was a time that it was like we were just punched with this awareness that we were manifesting in our marriage some pretty serious problems and within our family. These were the kind of problems that would bring you on your knees, and that's what it did. In March of '99, I was completely broken and on my knees at a retreat at our church. I was done. I realized that everything I tried to control in my life went sour. It was producing bad fruit. I had to give my will up to God. It was the first time that I really consciously remember offering my problems, my fears, all my doubts up to the cross. And that's what I did, and I felt so empowered by it. I felt for the first time that I understood what unconditional love was, what patience was, what fortitude was. That was a strength that I just had never known before. During this time, we acknowledged the sin and we sought forgiveness through the sacrament of reconciliation, and that's when our grieving began. It had many faces. On one hand, our marriage was becoming stronger as prayer entered it and as Christ became the center of our family. On the other hand, as prayer entered it, we became aware of the problems at its very core. We had wicked fights based on nothing. Dave's anger over the last few years continued to grow. He had a coldness about him, an insensitivity that scared me. I didn't know this man. I watched him go from an active man who took pride in himself, give up on himself. This is really no joke. When we were together, dinner, movie, friend's house, riding in the car, he was always falling asleep. For years. It used to drive me nuts. He continued to complain about the nagging pain in his scrotum. All these things, what they did to me was they made me feel, it became a deep-seated guilt for what I had done to him. I knew. I turned that guilt into anger. I turned it onto myself. I turned it onto my husband, and I turned it onto my children. I don't think at the time we consciously connected all of our problems or most of our problems with the sterilization, but it was always in the back of my mind festering. It was kind of like a spider spinning a web. You know that there's a beginning, but after a while, you can't see where the beginning is. It just branches out into all these different areas of your life. It becomes extremely overwhelming. The next couple of years, our marriage stayed in this manic state. Resentments grew. Dave's confidence in himself was low, as was mine. We didn't trust each other. I had a really hard time trusting him as a wife should. I no longer felt loved or secure, and occasionally we started talking about separating, breaking our family. We had all of these problems, but yet we knew we had this enormous, deep-rooted love for each other, and that's what we coveted towards. We tried desperately to stay focused on our marriage, on Christ, on our children. We were in church all the time. It was the only place that we could find a sense of peace and security. Now, if you can imagine all this confusion, these really highs and these really lows, and one day, I just knew that I needed to bring life back into this marriage. And I asked David, I had talked to him and about the horrible mistake we had made. And I knew that our suffering, to me, was because we couldn't have any more children and that he couldn't give me any more children. I figured that's what's going on with him. So I asked him if he would have a reversal. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but this baby thing, it was much deeper than that. But I asked him, I said, would you have a reversal? And he pretty much dismissed that there was no way he was going to go under the knife. I saw the fear and the fight was ahead, and I didn't feel like I had the right to impose like I had imposed it years ago, and I let it go. Well, if we can't have any more children, then we'll adopt. And to my surprise, he was open to this, and the next thing I know, we opened our hearts again with a sincere heart to children, and God opened it even wider and gave us 3 of the least of his little ones to take care of, and those children are just a blessing. Okay, well, this sounds like a really great ending to a sad beginning. Everything's good. We have more children. We have forgiveness in our life for a wrong that we blindly committed. Well, everything wasn't okay. Yes, we had God's forgiveness. We had a beautiful family with 8 children. So what was that sadness in my husband? What was all this pent-up anger about? And when was that horrible, saddening void going to go away every time we joined together in the most intimate way? Our physical relationship seemed fine. The spiritual connection during our sacramental lovemaking was there, but it was always coupled with a sadness. We were in some kind of exile, and by this time we knew why. It wasn't about having another baby. No matter how much forgiveness and love was given to us by the Father, the reality of our life, of our union, was that we were a contracepting couple. My grief, needless to say, it really started taking on a new form. I mean, I was under stress, but it was really coming down on me hard. It went from the emotional to the physical. In 2001, my health deteriorated. I was in constant pain. I was swollen all the time. And you know, I had for several years felt aches and pains here and there. I had fibromyalgia, but it was manageable. This was completely unmanageable. I couldn't take care of myself. I couldn't take care of my kids. I had hundreds of sores all over my arms and legs. I had the most horrible rash on my face. My breath was always short. I had heart palpitations that would wake me up in the middle of the night because I thought I was having a heart attack. For about 2 or 3 weeks out of the month, I felt pregnant. Imagine that. Every time I had a cycle, I'd start feeling pregnant. I used to joke around with my husband. We have this neurotic boxer that doesn't realize it's a dog. And she really doesn't. She would go through a cycle, and for about 2 weeks, she'd have false pregnancy. You know, she'd have the swollen breasts, and just the whole bit, steal all of our electronics and our phones and hide them under the bed. I didn't do that, but she did that. So, I really felt at the time that, and this was my big theory, you know, I used to share with David, that I really thought that my body was shutting down its fertility because it knew it could not have any more children. I thought all these female problems I was having was because we had ourselves sterilized. And that was an enormous amount of grief for me. Over the course of a year, I went from being able to ride my Tennessee walkers 20 miles in a day to not being able to ride at all. I couldn't even garden. Depression set in. I was losing everything. I tried many antidepressants, and the only thing that got me was 40 pounds heavier and way more depressed. It was not good. In January of 2002, after many doctor visits and many tests, I was diagnosed with systemic lupus, fibromyalgia, which I knew I had, and a degenerative disc disease. So what brought all this on, I asked my rheumatologist. Well, with great speculation, he said, we really don't know what causes lupus. It's in your genes. You're predisposed to it and a bunch of stuff like this. But we do know that it feeds off of stress. You got any stress in your life? Well, yeah, I got 8 kids, you know. But it wasn't the children. These kids are my joy. They're my sanctuary. They're gifts. My stress was myself. It was my guilt. It was the fact that I was living a lie. I took all of that pain and that guilt and I reflected it onto my children. I reflected it onto my husband and onto myself. It was how I related to them or how I did not relate to them in a God-centered way. My stress was being an unwilling yet very active part of what I considered and what I understood the church to teach as the culture of death. I really missed my husband. I missed God's procreative, loving power in our union when we became one. I wanted to be among the culture of the living, and I wanted so desperately to take that shower and just wash the sin away, but I couldn't. Okay, so here I am sitting in Bernie Padula's office talking about fertility care, but I can't have babies. It was a really strange first visit, I have to tell you. But we talked about the changes in my body and how the Cretan model might help me understand the female problems I was going through. And then they started talking about how my body works in relation to my husband. Well, I got to tell you, this stuff started making really good sense to me. I started getting some clarity. I always felt connected to this man as one, and I really longed to be there again. During one of these visits, the topic of reversal came up. Well, I knew, just like I knew a couple years ago, that this is exactly where we needed to go. We needed to heal. And I could see, I was starting to undo that spider web. I could see how sterilization had affected our life. God never intended for him and I to mutilate ourselves. Yet he gave us the free will to go down that road. And I knew if I turned back to him with faith and prayer, he would open new doors, possibly use this experience to help others. My attitude started to change, and with it my health. The shortness of breath went away, the heart palpitations went away, the red mask on my face became less severe. The joint pain and back pain was still there, but nowhere near as bad. With good medication and a good attitude, I was managing my life again. And I knew what I needed to do. I needed to pray for fertility. It was pretty much that simple. I prayed that God's will in our lives would be done. I prayed that we would be made whole again because I knew that my Father in heaven did not want us to be broken. And I was really becoming literally, physically sick of exercising my will when it came to life. My husband seemed a little more receptive at this time. However, he wasn't quite ready to jump. He was scared, and who could blame him? His scrotal pain was real, and he didn't want to go into that blade. We had financial concerns that were serious. We couldn't afford this. And we still harbored social fears, pressure. Again, God was teaching me to let go of my will and trust in him. I had to let Dave come to this understanding on his own. That didn't mean I couldn't seek counsel and help him get through that, but I wasn't pushing. We talked to the Badulahs about our concerns with the finances, and they introduced us to the Edith Stein Foundation. We still needed spiritual direction, and we talked to several priests. What we got out of that was, you're forgiven, but you're under no obligation. Well, I got to tell you, this kind of vague counseling was not helping us. It was, with that and our financial debt and the social pressures and his fear, there was no way I was going to get this man to see the truth. I knew that he wanted us to be open to the possibility of life. I knew we built a dam when we sterilized, and that breaking that dam would allow God's graces to flow. My husband was in a turmoil, he was in a battle, and there was a moment there where, that was causing problems in of itself. And I asked him, do you want me to let this go? Do you want me to find healing in another way? He took my hand, and I will never forget this because he was pretty upset that day, and he just got very calm. And he took my hand and he said, no, please pray for me. Again, I put it in God's hands, and I prayed to the Father that if it was his will to show us with clarity, show Dave with clarity. I prayed to our Heavenly Mother, I prayed to Edith Stein, I prayed to Padre Pio, I prayed to anybody who would listen to pray for us. And that's what they did. They did pray for us. And before I knew it, Bernie and Dominic were on the phone, and it really did seem like it was out of the blue. What are you going to do? Is what they asked. Well, I explained to them. I explained that Dave was still in discernment and that he was concerned about the finances. Well, he had an issue about accepting charity, and Bernie was like, well, we told you about the Edith Stein Foundation, so, these things just weren't working. But Dominic, he sounded so sure and confident. He was like this guidepost. I knew that they were sent by God. I knew that he had answered my prayer. That conversation left me with a feeling of hope and direction. Dominic sent us to Father McCaffrey to help Dave with his discernment, and that's what he did. He spoke God's words with clarity. There was absolutely no lukewarmness about this conversation. Nothing politically correct. We knew when we left there exactly where we stood. And for Dave, this was the fork in the road. He had to make a choice. There was nothing blocking him now. He had to choose God and life or remain a part of what we understood to be the culture of death. Well, he gave me the most wonderful gift. He chose life. Dave had his sterilization reversed by a wonderfully skilled surgeon. This time when he went in, I was so full of faith. And when he came out, I cannot tell you how much gratitude and joy I felt and love. And all I could do was look at him and say, there you are. And I said that because when he came out, I was hit with this surge of light. I knew instantly where my husband had been, where we had been, what all those problems were about. I expected healing, but this was like instantaneous. It was just, I remember seeing Dominic coming to visit us and when Dave was coming out, and I couldn't speak. I was just in awe. The initial healing was obvious. There was a sense of joy and rebirth, which is still with us today. So much confusion was replaced with an understanding. It was like God said, "Here, let me open your eyes." And he did. During this time, we kept my parents informed. I prayed for their conversion. And it was ironic, but one day before he had his reversal, my parents came up to spend 3 weeks with us from Florida. And they have also experienced a healing. Dave is a new man, and our confidence is so much stronger. Our laughter and our joy is the norm. I really missed that laughter. The time Dave spends with the kids and I is more intimate. But the most noticeable grace to return is a simple kindness and respect for one another. The pettiness is just gone. Physically, we saw changes in a few weeks. Dave was exercising without me nagging him. His pain in his scrotum was gone, and he no longer fell asleep all the time. This was a miracle. I am not kidding you, it really was. My health continues to get better and better. My stress level has decreased dramatically, which means my lupus is in remission. My headaches and my joint pain are less severe. Some of my female problems, like feeling pregnant all the time, it's gone. Our overall spirit is healthy, and we continue to be in awe of all this healing. And we have no doubt that God is going to continue to heal us more and more. The sterilization ended more than our ability to procreate. It cut off God's flow of grace in our marriage. It was that simple. It gave power to guilt, anger, and so many other insecurities. It made it difficult for us to share on anything deeper than the physical or the material. Until we brought the light of God and prayer into our life, we stayed in the darkness. Answering God's call to reverse, it replaced fear with faith, hurt and anger with healing and love. Our marriage is a sacrament. It's a gift from Christ. As in all sacraments, Christ is very much alive and present. When we brought this sin into our marriage, we put a wall between Christ and ourselves when we became one. Again, having this reversal was not about having a baby. It was a call to change and correct a terrible wrong and to live up to a promise that we made before God. That promise God kept bringing me back to. And that was simply to become one with each other and to be open to God's procreative life in our union. As a Christian, I understood that I had to live by the whole picture. As I developed in my spirituality, I had to include those things that society deems burdensome and unnecessary, such as life. There is a healing fragrance and a beauty in being a child of God, loving Him and serving Him. My call as a member of life is to give fully to God that fragrant love and to be simply open to the possibility of life. Thank you very much.